Okay,
Okay, Dr. Bob Turner is a longtime on island and its former mayor. I didn't even realize they had one. He's a retired federal geoscientist and author of several books on the geology of the Vancouver and Sea to Sky region. I see Bob started screen sharing. Okay, he's also a filmmaker with over 45 short movies about wildlife and wild places around the Salish Sea. A number of these videos were circulated to Delta Naps. If you missed them, or if you want to see more, check out Bob's YouTube channel and his website, which is oursalishsea.ca. And interesting enough, Bob was part of a team that achieved the UNESCO Biosphere Region designation for Howe Sound in 2021. And I don't know how many people have watched some of those series on the Knowledge Network of the Biosphere regions, but I'm pretty sure that they did the Howe Sound one there too. And Bob currently leads the One Island Conservancy's Biodiversity Conservation Initiative. So tonight, Bob is going to pull back the curtain on stories behind some of the geological intrigues of the Salish Sea region, which geologically has it all. We've got glacier-carved fiords, volcanoes, an island-strewn sea, and much, much more. So Bob's going to take us behind the scenes and tell us about estuaries to ice ages, tidal flats to topony, and all the geological intrigues of the Salish Sea. Thanks, Bob. Looking forward to this.
okie doke. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Delta Naturalists. It's wonderful to be talking to you tonight. We live in a remarkable part of the world, the Salish Sea region, and of course, it's famous for its whales and salmon, but it's also famous for its scenic beauty as an island-studded inland sea surrounded by mountains and volcanoes. And it's those landscapes and the stories behind those landscapes that I really want to focus on tonight. So, a little bit about me. I'm a Ontario kid originally. 1974, I went on a canoe trip up on the Nahanni River in the Northwest Territories and sort of discovered mountains and never looked back. Pretty much lived on the West Coast most of since then. I did my graduate work down in California at Stanford University, and when I finished my PhD, I came up and started a job with the Geological Survey of Canada in their office in Vancouver. And I was hired as a mineral deposit specialist, but my 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 deep passion was really education. And one of the things I thought, for a research institution that we were, a research organization, was that we served the minerals industry and the oil industry and the technical industry very well, but we weren't doing a particularly good job telling stories and informing stories about the issues, the geological issues of the Vancouver region of the BC region, and so that really became a focus for me over time. I worked with John Clegg, who went on to Simon Fraser University. But we were partners on a number of products that were really trying to tell the geological stories that we felt were really important to the residents of the Lower Mainland and of British Columbia. So I retired in 2014 and I started making movies. And I just assumed because I'd done so much geological work that I'd make movies about geology. Well, 10 years later, I haven't made one. And part of that is the Salish Sea is just very distracting. It's so full, of everything from herring to salmon to whales to birds. They're just stories galore. And I have to admit, it sort of made geology look a little bit lame. So, anyways, 10 years later, which is about right now, I'm trying to turn the corner. And this talk to you tonight really is my sort of first geology talk in about a decade. So I'm very keen to do it, and I'm keen to hear your questions back because I'm sort of calibrating myself against, what interests people, what are people's questions, how do they think about what they see, etc. So, anyways, I look forward to your questions at the end of the talk. Okie doke. The Salish Sea. So just so we're all clear on what I'm talking about, the talk will be about the lands that surround the Salish Sea. And the Salish Sea itself is the three-part, three-armed Strait of Georgia, Puget Sound, Strait of Juan de Fuca, that collectively is this inland sea, largely either inland of or between Vancouver Island and the Olympic Peninsula. Now, the theme that's going to run through tonight is the question why. We've got these landscapes, and what I'm interested in talking about, in part, it's the what, but more importantly, it's the why. Why do we have these things? And I think many of them we just sort of assume they just are, and maybe haven't really thought about what stands behind them. So the first thing I want to talk about is, I would say, the most outstanding feature of the region, and that is mountains. Mountains are a sort of a defining feature of the Salish Sea and basically coastal British Columbia, but Nova Scotia doesn't have mountains. Louisiana doesn't have mountains. Those are both coastal areas. Much of the coastline of Canada doesn't have mountains along the coast. So why do we? Well, that's actually, there's a lot tangled into answering that question. So first of all, I just wanted to start with the notion of a mountain. And when we look at mountains, and I'm guilty of this too, we immediately go to the peaks where we would consider all the drama is, all the sharp, craggy peaks and the snowfields, sometimes glaciers, whatever, often landslides have marked them, etc. But in fact, the active agent in the mountain landscapes are not the peaks at all. They're actually just sort of passive. They just ride along for the show. It's the valleys, and it's the rivers and sometimes glaciers that are carving those valleys. And as those valleys get deeper, the height of the mountains get taller. I mean, in terms of the height from valley bottom to mountain peak. And so I'd like to, comfortably say that there is no mountain without a valley. And so I want to explore that notion. First of all, a really interesting place to experience a valley, which again, I'm going to restate the fact we overlook them. But if you go to Whistler, and I've got a big clunky cursor here I'm going to use, this is Whistler Village. This is the Blackcomb Gondola to the top of Blackcomb Mountain. This is the Whistler Gondola to the top of Whistler Mountain. And between the two peaks, I'm sure many of you know this, is this gondola called the Peak to Peak. And it essentially hangs across the valley of Fitzsimmons Creek. And when you're on it, you're sort of looking up the valley, and inevitably you're looking at the mountain peaks which grab your attention. But what I want to point out is that what a valley represents is an extraordinary amount of missing rock. Like, those mountains are mountains because the river, as well as glaciers in between, have essentially carved the valley deep, leaving these high edges that we call mountains. So then that begs the question, what creates deep valleys? If tall mountains require deep valleys, what then creates deep valleys? And the answer to that is uplift. And when I say uplift, I'm talking about the general rising of the land surface. And this is a little cartoon. We have the before, a lowland, and then there is a tectonic process which causes the land to rise, creating an elevated plateau and catalyzing erosion on the margins of the plateau. The rising plateau has an edge. The edge is a gradient. That gradient creates the energy that flowing water then has the ability to erode. And over time, that erosion carves the rising plateau into a series of river valleys and mountains in between. So we come back to another question. Well, if uplift drives the formation of deep valleys that then create the mountain landscapes, what creates the uplift around the Salish Sea? And the answer to that is deep below our feet, probably about 100 kilometers deep below our feet. And we are right now, as we sit here listening to this talk, in a collision. It's an ongoing creeping collision between two giant tectonic plates. The one that we're on, a continental plate, which is the North American continental plate, which is driving westwards. And it's driving westwards and overriding an oceanic plate that is under the Pacific Ocean offshore, and it is being sort of forced to depth. And that collision of those two tectonic plates creates uplift in two different ways. The first is by jacking up the outer edge of the continent, creating the Olympic Peninsula and Vancouver Island. And that jacking up happens because as the ocean plate slides underneath the continental plate, a whole bunch of stuff is scraped off, essentially sediments, rocks that are caught on the front end of the continental plate and essentially wedged underneath and uplift the outer edge. So that really is a driving mechanism for creating the mountains of Vancouver Island and the Olympic Peninsula. Further inboard, where we are, the Coast Mountains, the Cascade Mountains, they're driven by a second process, which is thermal expansion. And you can see, and of course, I didn't really explain, but what we're looking at here is a cross section through the Earth. So we're looking at the surface of the Earth from just south of Vancouver, about the latitude of Seattle, looking north across the surface of the globe. And then we're looking at a cross section cut. So it's an artistic view of what science has been able to tell us about what's going on there, but artistically rendered. Anyways, as the ocean plate descends, it releases water as hydrous minerals are transformed to non-minerals. That water escapes, it catalyzes the melting of rock about 100 kilometers down, and melted rock is lighter because it's a liquid relative to the solid rock around it. So it essentially rises buoyantly wherever it can, wherever there's a channel or some avenue of rise. And in rising, it carries heat with it, and it heats the whole continental plate. And so when something heats up, it expands. And there's only one way that the continental plate can expand, and that's up. It's hemmed in on all other sides. So that creates uplift. So I'd like to take you to South America for a very short moment, but it was an experience that I still remember to this day because it was such an insight into the mountain building process. So we were driving. I was working with the Geological Survey of Canada at the time. We were driving from Santiago down on the coastal plain up to the high plateau of the Altiplano, and we were driving through the Andes Mountains to get there. And so up we drove. We're following a river valley that's sort of cutting into the landscape, creating the mountains above us. And as we drove up, interestingly, the mountains got shorter above us. And finally, we popped out at the elevation at the top of the mountains onto a plateau. And it was such a visceral experience that, yes, this is the sort of the elevated plateau, and the mountains actually are lower than the plateau, and they are carved from the plateau. This is the big piece of wood, you might say, metaphorically, and the mountains are what has been carved from that big piece of wood. So here we are in the Altiplano, or it's just Spanish for high plain. And so schematically, this is what we were looking at. We had sort of come up the from the lowlands up through the mountains where the edge of the plateau had been dissected, and then finally drove up and out onto the plateau surface. Okay, well, what does that have to say about British Columbia, home, and the Salish Sea? Well, the first question is, well, if we go up into the Coast Range Mountains, will we find such a remnant plateau? And here we are on Blackcomb Mountain. We're looking out across Whistler Mountain, sort of off to the west. And this inset photo is we've moved over to Whistler Mountain, and now we're looking back to the east. And in both cases, what's interesting is that no, there's no plateau out there. But what there is a very even top to the mountains in both cases. And I think what we're looking at is essentially a bunch of peaks that are nudging up to the top of what was the old plateau service. And so that illustrates the general plateau surface that was uplifted and then got carved into the Coast Range Mountains. The reason why the Coast Range may not have the plateau that the Andes do, the Andes is much drier, the rates of erosion are much lower because of the dryness and the lack of essentially rainfall and snowfall to really do the active cutting. And we also, this is glaciated terrain, which add glaciers on top of rivers, and these mountains have really been chewed up. So that's really the schematic for the plateau, with sort of schematically shown where the old plateau surface is here, and the peaks generally conform to the top. Now, every peak isn't going to reach that top, but if you sort of pick the high peaks that move across the horizon, they would all sort of scribe out the general elevation of the plateau surface. Let's shift gears. So we've talked about mountains. Let's move to the fjord coast, which is the second, I would say, outstanding feature of the Salish Sea. A fjord coast imposed upon a mountainous terrain. This is an image from Google Earth. I like it because the coastline has been highlighted in yellow. And what you see, and the yellow highlighting does a very good job at it, is the incredibly convolute and intricate coast of British Columbia, with all these deep coastal inlets cutting in. The Norwegians call these glacier-carved inlets fiords, and we've adopted that name. And those that fjord coast extends down into Puget Sound. Interestingly, it stops about the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and south of that, the coast is what I'd call a straight coast. It's not complex and convolute at all, in large part. And so we have these two coasts that really we need to reconcile. Like, why would a coast be so intricate and convolute immediately adjacent to one that wasn't? So the answer, and many of you probably know this, rests with the ice ages. And this is something of a cartoon, artistic rendering of what the maximum extent of ice looked like on the North American continent as viewed from space. And you can see that most of Canada was covered either by what's called the Laurentide ice sheet, or in the west, the Cordilleran ice sheet. And all that really escaped the wrath of the ice are some areas of northern Yukon and a little bit of Haida Gwaii. So that is the ice cover. Now, I should be clear that the ice ages, they span from, a little more than 2.5 million years ago to about 11,500 years ago. And just to be clear, 11,500 years ago to a geologist is yesterday. We're talking about, a multi-billion-year-old planet where most of the rocks that form in our landscape around Vancouver are between 300 million years old and 100 million years old. So that something was that extensive so recently, 11,500 years ago, is really quite extraordinary. Anyways, back to our Salish Sea, and I'll just put on that map the future site of Vancouver and the future site of Portland. And that'll give you enough reference to realize that the extent of the fjord coast matches to a T the extent of the glaciers. What was not glaciated is a straight coast. What was glaciated was or is became a fjordland on the British Columbia west coast. What would that look like? Well, we get a bit of a clue as to what this glaciated BC coast looks like from Greenland of today. So this is a view from a plane looking inland along the coast of Greenland. And imagine this is British Columbia. At the top up here, we would be looking into the interior of British Columbia. Let's just for argument's sake say that Prince George is somewhere out here, and then completely covered with ice, or future Prince George. And then you can see that the ice comes to the coast mountains and starts to essentially spill through valleys with the peaks riding above the ice. And the ice starts from these ice fields, flows into these glaciers, and then the glaciers literally flow through the mountains, carving deep valleys until they reach the ocean. And there's a little patch of ocean visible in behind the jet engine right there. It's much better shown right here. So you can see a glacier coming down to tidewater and then hitting the ocean. And this sprinkling of white is a sprinkling of icebergs breaking off the glacier. So that evokes what the coast of British Columbia would have looked like during the Ice Age. And the interesting thing about glaciers is that they can do what rivers cannot do. A river, Fraser River, cannot cut down below sea level. I mean, whereas a glacier, because of its height and the mass of the ice that sort of floats above the surface, actually can press down below sea level and actively carve the seafloor to a deep, well below sea level. If you remember that an iceberg, 90% of an iceberg is hidden below sea level, we only see the upper 10%. What that tells you is that a glacier can be in water 9 times the height of what is above the ocean level, and it can still, if it's flowing down, can still be carving the seafloor deeper. So a glacier that is 100 meters thick can carve basically 90 meters of depth below sea level. So let's just take a little look here at what the Salish Sea country, our country, might have looked like prior to the Ice Age. It would have looked a lot like modern southern Washington state, Oregon, California, a pretty straight coast where rivers run out to the sea, much like the Columbia River does in present day Oregon, Washington border. So in this sketch, modern Vancouver would sit here, modern Seattle or future Seattle would sit here, basically 150 kilometers from the ocean, way inland. We would be sitting in a broad valley system drained by rivers that would have drained out to the sea between what in the future will become Vancouver Island and the Olympic Peninsula. During the Ice Age, the ice essentially flowed out of the interior to the ocean in the north, but in the Salish Sea area, It got captured in this big north-south trending valley, flowed south, and then pulled a sharp U-turn and headed to the ocean through what, whoops, jumped the gun there, um, through what will become Strait of Juan de Fuca. And one particular lobe of the ice sheet ran south into what is now Puget Sound. And so on the right is the geography of today. Take-home message, the Salish Sea is younger than the Ice Age. It is of the age of the Ice Age. It is a child of the Ice Age, whereas the Pacific Ocean itself has been around in various forms, for probably 1 billion years. The Salish Sea is only less than 2 million years old. It's just a very recent addition to the larger Pacific Ocean that was carved when the ice came to the Pacific, rejigged the coastline, and created this inland sea. Okay, well, let's take a look at the landscape and do a little detective work and just try to figure out how high were those Ice Age glaciers. Can we figure it out based on the landscapes around us? Well, if we head up the highway, Highway 99, Sea to Sky Highway, just before we get to Squamish, we pass below the base of Squamish Chief Mountain. And right here is the parking lot that you see just as you crest the hill below the big cliffs and descend the hill down into Squamish. And this is the camp, or this is the parking lot itself. And we're looking up at that big cliff face, which is this big cliff face. So those of you who have driven past the parking lot on the opposite side, on the west side of the highway, on the southbound side of the highway, might have noticed this very beautifully polished rolling whaleback surface, which is carved into granite and was exposed when they were building the highway, and they stripped soil that had been sitting on this rock surface and actually protecting it from weathering. So let's just go over there, take a little closer look. And here we got two folks taking a close look at those polished surfaces, and you can see how it glints in the weak winter light in this photograph. And if we were to put our noses where those folks have their noses, what we'd see would be a polished surface with some very distinct lineations, little fine grooves, 1 millimeter, 2 millimeter wide, over top of the polished surface. The two are on the same surface and basically part and parcel of the same thing. These are essentially the tracks of Ice Age glaciers. Now, to be clear, a glacier or the ice of a glacier can't carve rock. It's way too soft. It would just skid across it. However, the glaciers are full of embedded grit, sand, pebbles, gravel, boulders, and it's that grit and stone which does the work of the glacier. The glacier provides the movement and the weight that then turns those protruding pebbles and grit into like diamond anvils that are scratching the rock below it. What's interesting is that if we leave the parking lot, we climb up Squamish Chief, which is 700 meters up. When we get there, we find the same polished surface with the same scratches, all sort of aligned in a north-south direction, parallel to Howe Sound, which we can conclude was the direction of the ice travel as it flowed down Howe Sound. Well, that begs the question, if the top of the Chief at 700 meters elevation is covered with these scratches, clearly the glaciers were thicker than 700 meters. Well, how thick were they? This gives us a maximum or minimum. What was the maximum? And the height of those glaciers is in fact written very clearly in the mountains. And this happens to be a view taken right from Horseshoe Bay at the ferry terminal, looking up the sound, and it's taken with a telephoto lens. So of course, everything is shortened together. But what you're looking at in the foreground is Boyer Island, low elevation, maybe 150 meters high. And then further in the background, there's part of the Sunshine Coast, which is a sort of a much more rugged, more elevated, but still rounded skyline, probably at, maybe 700 meters elevation. And then we get up to the high craggy peaks of the Tantalus Range that go up pretty much to close to 3,000 meters. Those three surfaces tell us a huge amount about the height of the Ice Age. And the answer is pretty much that. Only the craggy mountain peaks were spared the rounding effects of the Ice Age glacier. And the high intermediate peaks had a very thin glacier ice over them, and they were partially rounded. But the very low hills, and particularly the subsea trough of Howe Sound, had a very, very thick glacier over top of it, resulting in a very smooth surface. And what's interesting is if you go around the Salish Sea, the Olympic Mountains, you see it. If you look over at the mountains of Vancouver Island, Cascade Mountains, if you just stand and look at the landscape, you'll see the same pattern repeated. Low hills are rounded, intermediate ones are a little less rounded, and the high peaks are craggy, if they're high enough. If they're above what generally the height of the ice, well, in Delta where you sit right now, between say 15 to 18,000 years ago, you would be sitting below 2 kilometers of ice. And so in general, it's about 6,000 feet of ice was covering the Vancouver region. So if the peaks are higher than that, they should retain some element of their craggy top. Okay, back to mountains. Let's just pick volcanoes, which without doubt are sort of the iconic mountain of Salish Sea. In part because some of them at least have this beautiful symmetry, but probably more particularly, they tend to stand alone, which is a really interesting fact given what we've talked about how mountains form. In general, if mountains are only created by valleys, they essentially happen in clusters. They happen in mountain ranges. However, volcanoes are a completely different beast. They aren't carved by river valleys so much as they are built by volcanic eruptions. So their rules are all different for volcanoes, and they can essentially build themselves anywhere. As a result, Mount Rainier stands absolutely by itself, 14,000 feet high, towering over the highest peaks of the Cascade Range, which are less than 10,000. But more particularly, all by itself. So closer to home, you folks in Delta have such a gorgeous view of Mount Baker so often. And up in my neck of the woods, Bowen Island, we have the Garibaldi, Mount Garibaldi, which doesn't look like a volcano, but I'll come back to that in a sec. So I've already sort of spoken to really what creates volcanoes. It is this melting that occurs as the oceanic plate descends, releases water, causes melting, and that liquid magma rises. And so if it fails to make the surface and cools, it'll turn into some type of granite-like rock. But if it keeps going and can make it to the surface, it erupts as a volcano. And where there are sort of long-standing conduits to the surface releasing magma, we build volcanoes. So we call that area down there really I call it the magma factory, which feeds the volcano above. And next time you look at volcano, what I'd like you to reflect on is that it's a bit like, a mushroom. It's just sort of the fruiting body at the top of a big subterranean network, which is invisible to us, but does extend at least probably more likely 100 kilometers depth into the deep earth below us. Now, a quick one, Mount Garibaldi. Any of you who have paused on the Sea to Sky Highway at the viewpoint that has a very commanding view of Mount Garibaldi might not even recognize it as a volcano because, heck, it actually looks a lot like a mountain, other than it pretty much stands by itself. Well, the reason it doesn't look like a volcano is that half of the volcano is gone. Half of the volcano, the whole western flank, collapsed into the valley beside it, and sort of breaking up that beautiful symmetry. And the reason for this is that Mount Garibaldi erupted during the ice ages, and it built half of its edifice on solid rock, but perhaps unfortunately for it, it built half of its edifice on glacier ice. And when the ice age ended and the glacier melted, that whole foundation was lost, and the mountain, half the mountain, collapsed into the Squamish-Cheakamus Valley to the west. Okay, well, I couldn't give a talk to the Delta naturalist without talking about the Fraser Delta. So the rest of the talk is going to sort of focus on your home turf. And I'm sort of coming at it from sort of a geological perspective. And the Delta has lots of stories. But my basic question is, what makes the Delta as it is? And to do that, I'm going to use a map, a satellite image. And I just want to sort of go through the geography of the satellite image because I'll come back to it a number of times. So let's just position ourselves. We've got the Fraser River here coming in from the east, flowing past Surrey. New Westminster would be here. The channel splits into the main arm. This is Burns Bog. It's this big, bright or dark green patch. The river flows at Steveston right here on the south edge of Richmond, which is this island. It meets the Salish Sea and the Strait of Georgia. And let's just look at a few other things up here. YVR Airport on Sea Island between the north and middle arms. And then as we move south, I was about to say Rifle Island. You're going to have, I'm embarrassed.
West of Island.
Westham. Oh my goodness. Sorry about that. Westham Island, canoe passage. And then as we move south, the big Delta port and BC Ferries Terminal. Point Roberts, your much loved Boundary Bay, and then the uplands that surround the Delta. The White Rock uplands here, the Surrey uplands here, and the Vancouver uplands to the north. So that's the basic geography, and I want to then sort of move back and forth to this figure as I talk. So the first thing that I want to speak to is the fact that the Fraser Delta is the mouth of a giant. The Fraser River drains 1/3 of British Columbia. It's the third largest river flowing into the Pacific Ocean in North and South America, in both of the Americas. Only the Columbia and the Yukon rivers are larger. So it's a giant, and it's a giant river that flows into a relatively small inland sea. And as such, it's interesting, it's sort of protected from the big storm waves of the open Pacific, and that creates some of its characteristics. It's protected waters that it flows into. Now, the river, the Fraser, as it flows between relatively high banks, it crosses some floodplains, but generally, through most of its course, it's bound by uplands, um, and it flows as a single channel. It has some small islands in it, um, but the river comes back into a single channel. What's interesting is that when it hits New Westminster, it splits. It splits into the North Arm and the Middle Arm, and then downstream splits again into the Middle and the North Arm. Sorry, I meant this is the main arm, and then here it sort of splits again down into Canoe Passage and the main arm. And this is a characteristic of pretty much deltas worldwide, is that when they leave the confines of the valleys and they enter onto their floodplain, they're unconfined. They're just bound by flat land, and it becomes quite easy during sort of flood events for the river to sort of switch channels and sometimes hang on to those channels over time. So that's one characteristic, is that the delta is a big floodplain, which you all know, dead flat. I mean, stunningly flat. Stunningly flat when you think about it in a geography, a coastal geography where flat landscapes are very, very rare. In fact, the only flat landscapes that we really find around the Salish Sea are other river deltas, just like the Fraser. But all of them, except for the Skagit, are much smaller in size. So now a floodplain is an interesting entity because when it floods, it really turns into a lake. It's a lake form. And there is strong current where the river channel exists, but where it spills out, and these are little cartoon cross sections. This is, call it the Fraser River before the flood, when it sort of sits between its banks. During the flood, it spills across. Now, of course, this is without the addition of flood levees, and flood dikes, which prevent the flooding. But in a unconfined and prior to diking Fraser River, this is what would have happened. The current would have stayed strong in the channel itself, but once it spills across into this sort of broad lake, the velocity is lost and the mud, silt, sand settles out. And after many floods, the floodplain, has built up, and it continues to build up. It will build up as high as the flood waters rise. And of course, as we know, that has created the rich agricultural soils of the Fraser Delta. But prior to sort of the tilling of the land, it supported, extremely rich wetlands and shrublands, forests, bogs, etc. Now, the Fraser River doesn't stop at the mouth of the Fraser River. It creates a plume that spreads out into the Salish Sea. It's a plume that is always muddier than the other Salish Sea waters, and this is a particularly striking contrast between the muddy Fraser waters and the dark blue, clear Salish Sea waters. The plume, as many of you will know, is actually only a thin surface layer that floats on top of the Salish Sea, sometimes 5 feet, sometimes as much as 10 feet thick. But you'll often see when the ferry crosses the plume margin that the prop wash stirs up the underlying clear Salish Sea water, and there is this stripe of Salish Sea water that follows in the wake of the ferry as it moves along. So, and let's go back to our satellite image of the Fraser Delta. And what I do love about this particular image, because it shows it so beautifully, is the Fraser River plume. And the Salish Sea waters are in this image, a very dark blue, almost black color. The river waters are this almost, basically very pale, milky blue that transitions into sort of aqua colors as it dilutes and mixes with the Salish Sea. But, oops, what did I do there? If you follow the main channel out, which carries the bulk of the Fraser River water, you can see it firing out as a jet into the offshore waters of the Salish Sea. It's sort of pushing out. And then it's interesting how it sort of curls back on itself. It seems to sort of have gone this way, probably because of a past ebb tide that sort of pulled its sort of whoops, I keep losing that, the plume this way. And then perhaps what we're looking at is a subsequent flood tide, which carried the plume northwards. And who knows, maybe I'm just imagining this. We might even be catching sort of the impact of the next ebb tide as it sort of curls and ends this sort of northward migration. All of that to say is that the plume, once it's in the Salish Sea, gets basically sloshed around by the ebb and flow of ebb and flood tides in the Salish Sea. Important to note that the plume goes all the way over the Gulf Islands. This happens to be Galliano Island. And you can see that the plume is essentially depositing mud all the way across the Strait of Georgia, right up to the shores of the Gulf Islands. Now, the mud also gets dumped, much of it, right, and particularly when the river is flowing at a high tide, and the shoreline is right at the high tide mark. A lot of that mud will get trapped on the what are exposed later at a low tide as tidal flats. And that, of course, is the rich substrate upon which the marsh communities and tidal flat ecologies are all built. Now let's just pause and look again at this satellite image, because the other reason I love this image is because it is taken at a very low tide and it beautifully displays the tidal flats. And so here on the western edge of the delta, you can see the tide flats are in these shades of brown, cut by tidal channels that are draining with very muddy water out into the Salish Sea. So this is the tide flat. My pointer is following a tide channel, which joins another tide channel that then carries these the muds off the tide flats and into the deep waters and out into the Salish Sea. And those brown tide flats continue all the way down to the delta port. Interestingly, there's a color change at the delta port. Suddenly there's quite a bit of green on the tide flat, even likewise on the tide flat south of the ferry terminal. And it's really well displayed on the tide flats of Boundary Bay. And I am presuming what that image is picking up are the eelgrass beds that dominate in the Boundary Bay and in these areas, which, well, I'm jumping ahead of my story there, but it's an interesting observation that the western tide flats don't have dominant eelgrass, whereas Boundary Bay and some of these southern parts of the western edge do. And let's just take a look at an oblique view. Here, this is Steveston. Here's the Fraser River flowing towards us. Canoe Pass, Westham Island, Rifle Bird Sanctuary here. And we're looking across from this river-dominated western edge of the delta across to Boundary Bay that completely lacks any outlet of the Fraser River. And that creates two fundamentally different shore faces on the Fraser Delta. A river-dominated one, which is flushed by very fresh or brackish and very muddy waters, and the Boundary Bay and these other areas that are partly isolated from the river waters, where the water is much more saline, salty, as is the Salish Sea, because there isn't river water, and it is much clearer. And it makes sense that something like an eelgrass would need at least clearer waters to essentially photosynthesize through some of the tide cycle that it could not do on the very muddy riverfront delta. Okay, so I'm just about finished here. One of the last things I want to point to is that if we could remove all the water out of the Salish Sea and we just looked at the landscape of the Fraser Delta, we'd be surprised, I think. First of all, let's just locate ourselves. So this is an illustration with a lot of vertical exaggeration, but here's the Fraser. New Westminster would be right here. This is the Vancouver upland. This is the Surrey upland, and the Nicamico Serpentine Valley here, White Rock upland here. This is Boundary Bay, Point Roberts upland, ferry terminal, Delta Port. Steveston would sit right here on the edge of the main channel. The airport would sit right here on Sea Island. These are the green is all the land above the high tide level. The tide flats are painted in a pale gray, brown, and you can see that those tide flats exist, continue out as a very gently sloping surface, some distance below the lowest tide levels, and then fall off a cliff. Now, the cliff is vertically exaggerated here, but it's important to note that once you tumble off the edge of this, where the water might only be, 5-10 meters deep, you quickly tumble to depths of 100 meters, 200 meters, 300 meters depth. This is quite a steep face, and you can see that the channel of the Fraser actually connects to a submarine canyon that works its way down and carries some of the sand load that is carried by the river, dumped here, and it's carried down in avalanches, submarine avalanches that run out to the seafloor. Because this extends down 300 meters, what it's telling me is that the delta that we know and love, that is this flat surface we're comfortable with, is in fact the flat top of a thick pile of sand and silt that is in excess in places of 300 meters thick. It's a big pile of sand and silt, and we only see the very upper flat surface. And this front surface is growing seawards all the time as sand is continually added and mud is carried out in suspension and falls and drapes onto this surface. So, second last slide. This has resulted, this growing face of the delta over the last 10,000 years. And it has evolved. If we look 10,000 years ago in this compartment of the diagram, where we're looking 10,000 years ago, the delta sat only right at New Westminster. It was sort of a very small feature, and the future location of Steveston is way out here in the ocean. And there's also this thing right here, an island, which will become the future Point Roberts. But at this point, 10,000 years ago, it's an island. Whoops, lost it again. So let's fast forward 10,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago. The delta in 5,000 years has grown substantially. And one thing I wanted to say, just going back to 10,000 years ago, if I was an archaeologist and if I was looking for a First Nations habitation site that would have been on the delta front 10,000 years ago, I would be looking somewhere in the area of New Westminster, not around Steveston, because there was no land here at the time. And if I was looking for such a site about 5,000 years ago, I would be looking somewhere in this area, halfway between sort of YVR and New Westminster, in this area, this part of the delta, which in today's world would be somewhere back here, though it would be buried by subsequent floods. Anyways, 5,000 years ago, we have sort of half the delta we have today. Point Roberts is still an island. The Boundary Bay is actually receiving muddy water from the Fraser. This is a little bit conjectural, exactly where the river channels were. There could have been a channel further south here, but we know that Burns Bog is about this age, and it was forming right here. So it acted as some type of block to the river. And then we arrive at today with the delta that we know and love. So over 10,000 years, which to a geologist is just sort of like yesterday, the delta has created itself and all the remarkable life that it supports. And here's the thought that I want to leave you with. And that is that if, well, I was about to say if, but that's not correct. It's when. It's sort of like earthquakes. It's not, will there be another earthquake? No. There will be an earthquake. The only question is when. When will the Fraser River finally fill in the Salish Sea completely, returning it to the valley that it was before the ice ages? The Fraser River, you can see, has already accomplished a big chunk of this work in terms of just crossing the Strait of Georgia to the Gulf Islands. It's done that in 10,000 years. Another perhaps 20,000 years, and it may be creating a real squeeze here between mainland and the Gulf Islands. Of course, it's got to move north and south, and there's a lot of volume to fill there. So, but it could be in 100,000 years that the Fraser River, along with the help of the Skagit and the Cowichan and the Courtney and the Campbell and the Nisqually, all those rivers together, will fill in our much loved Salish Sea. And with that big thought, I will end the talk, and I'll take any questions from anybody who has some thoughts or comments or anything else.
Thank you very much, Bob. That was really fascinating. You touched on all kinds of things that I'd never thought of, but it was very, very interesting.
Bob, I have a couple of comments, questions. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I enjoyed every one of your slides and listening to the story. It was just amazing. One of the things and I'm sure you're aware of this, but one of the reasons we have such a really good sediment plume entering the Strait of the Salish Sea is because back in the 60s, we managed to prevent a hydropower project being built at a place called Marguerite on the Fraser River, because that would have basically stolen the sediment, most of the sediment that we now get enriching our delta. And for better or worse, so many rivers worldwide are suffering from this. The Columbia River is suffering from it. And I'd like to credit some very wise decisions back in the 60s that stopped a potential hydropower project on the Fraser, on the mainstream Fraser. It's just a comment. And I won't go on too much longer. I just found your slides outstanding. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Peter. You make a really good comment, and that is, dams, upstream dams, basically are big sediment traps. And without that sediment, everything downstream of the dam essentially is sediment deficient. And whereas the river would normally build, it takes away. And that would be a huge price to have paid. You also point to an interesting thing. You know, way back at the beginning of the talk, we were talking about valleys and valley formation and the loss of these huge amounts of rock. Where did that rock go to? Um, you know, in much of British Columbia, the ultimate resting place for so much of that eroded rock is the Fraser Delta. And what the nature has taketh away from the mountains, it has given to the Salish Sea as the Fraser Delta.
It's interesting. I think there's a comment or two here. Shanti said, that was absolutely amazing. Well done. I learned a lot. Thank you. That's so awesome. Thanks for sharing. And wonderful Jack and team. So that was for Jack's video. Does anyone else have more questions? I found that piece about the fjord land and the straight coast really fascinating. It never occurred to me about the ice age and the difference to the coastline that it made when the glaciers retreated. I'd never heard that before.
Well, and it's interesting. Of course, the Ice Age affected all of Canada, but prior to the Ice Age, there was no Hudson Bay, there was no Great Lakes, there was no Arctic islands. I mean, the mass was there, but all the channels that break up that big piece of northern Canada into the islands was one continuous strip of land. And so the glaciation did extraordinary things. Before the Ice Age, Newfoundland was part of the rest of the mainland. It wasn't an island. So it's not only the BC coast, but the rest of Canada was completely reconfigured by glacier ice. It's quite extraordinary. It's really fun to look at. If you just sort of Google sort of map of North America before the ice ages, if you can find one, you vaguely see the shape of North America, but it sure isn't what we know today.
Yeah. Yeah, you can really see it back in Ontario and places like Georgian Bay.
Oh boy, yeah.
Yeah, it's
you take away the Great Lakes and what's Ontario?
that's right.
I think Freddie has a question, Elizabeth. His hand is up.
Yes,
Hi, Bob, thanks. That's really very interesting. It's Claude here. I just wanted to know, are you saying that the eventual process will take the land like out as far as like the Gulf Islands and even maybe beyond? I mean, many, many thousands and thousands of years from now?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, prior to the most recent ice age, the North American continent hadn't had an ice age for, I'm thinking, at least 200 million years. And so it was a landscape that was completely dominated by rivers, and very much looks like all the parts of North America, most of the United States, which never received ice, never received the glacier ice. And so we had this very short period of time. It was very disruptive, carved all this intricate shoreline that was strictly using the logic of glaciers, which sort of carved deep and carved long along valleys. And that completely reconfigured our coast. However, the glaciers have gone and the rivers are back at work. And the rivers, you know, it's sort of like the tortoise and the hare. The glaciers are more like the tortoise, like they're super aggressive and they don't last long, but boy, they get a lot of work done in a short period of time. And then they go and the rivers come back and the rivers just start doing their work. And what do rivers do? They move stuff from inland to the shore, inland to the shore. And rather than carving the shore out, they add to it. And so they start to fill in all the nooks and crannies that the glaciers left. And that's what we're witnessing the Fraser doing. Fraser is a great example. It's sort of building in what used to be Salish Sea. And so now we're still in an ice age geologically, even though with our climate, with the sort of the human impacts on climate change, we've pretty much overcome, we think, any effects that the planet might have in pushing us back into an ice age. We're beyond that. So the ice isn't coming back. So looking forward, the rivers will just continue to dominate and running their course. And I'm guessing 100,000 years, maybe 200,000 years. Yeah, the Fraser will build a land bridge to Vancouver, to the Gulf Islands and to Vancouver Island, just like it built a land bridge to Point Roberts Island, which was much closer. And it will sort of reconnect Vancouver Island to the shore. Now, maybe tidal currents moving back and forth will sort of keep, a narrow tidal zone open, I'm guessing. All of this is speculation. But back to your question, yes. Ultimately, the Fraser is on its way to reconnecting mainland and Vancouver Island.
So would this also then work on the other side of the Pacific toward Canada and the United States? Are there rivers there that would actually bridge more land toward us from the other side of the Pacific?
You mean like in Japan and
Yeah,
China?
for Japan, for example, yeah.
Something else is afoot there. And between our shores and Japanese shores or the Far Eastern Russian shores, there's all sorts of movement of tectonic plates, which are moving faster and therefore bigger players than anything that the rivers can sort of accomplish on either edge of the Pacific Ocean. So what really is happening in Japan is very akin to here, those glaciated parts of Japan. What's happening is that the rivers are filling in the indents along the coast. That's really what rivers can do. But they're not really effective at pushing out beyond the continental margin. They just can't. They can't really deal with the big surf that's coming in. What happens in that circumstance is that the big surf just takes what the river provides and spreads it along the shore. And that's why you get straight shores fundamentally, is that all that sediment that's being fed by the rivers just gets sort of spread out, fills in all the bays. You get sort of spits running along the front of bays, and the shore straightens.
Another
Thank you.
comment
That's
here
fascinating.
another comment here from Nikki saying, I loved every bit of that. Becoming an educator was a very good decision for Bob. I agree.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Bob. I have a question. How fast is the North American continent moving westwards? And will that also affect what happens in the Salish Sea?
It's the rate of convergence between North America and the plate that is descending below it is about 2 to 3 millimeters a year. So that's the convergence rate. And that is sort of a combination of the speed of the North American plate moving westwards and this other plate moving quite slowly. It's actually just being pressed down. So to your answer, it's, I think, about 2 to 3 millimeters a year. And it's important to remember that North America is moving west because the Atlantic Ocean is getting wider. The North American plate goes all the way to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean where new crust is forming as the plates pull apart, and that North American plate moves west. So North America started to move west when the Atlantic Ocean, about 160 million years ago, started to open. And it's been moving west ever since. So, but the Salish Sea itself sits on top of, largely above, sits on the North American plate. So it's just sort of sliding along westwards with the North American plate. The outer part of Vancouver Island, though, is sort of a bit of a hybrid zone where it is being jacked up, as I mentioned, with material that is coming off the plate that's the ocean plate that's diving underneath. It's being jacked up by stuff that's being ripped off of that plate and driven in underneath Vancouver Island. So the very west edge of Vancouver Island is a bit of a hybrid zone, though it technically is all part of the North American plate. We really don't see the Pacific plate. It's at 2,000 meters depth offshore, and it never comes any higher than that. It just slides even deeper underneath the edge of North America. So what might change the Salish Sea are crustal faults that snap because of the tension building in this collision. And there's a fault that has been documented that runs east-west right through Seattle, and that snapped and created a local tsunami in that area. That sort of changed the local shoreline of Bainbridge Island, which is just west of downtown Seattle. And there are definitely active faults as well that run from Puget Sound underneath the Strait of Juan de Fuca and run very close to the city of Victoria. And those are active faults too. And if any of those snapped, something is going to go up, something's going to go down, and the local shoreline will probably be rejigged because of that.
All right.
Any more questions, comments?
Bob, I'm curious a little bit about the dating. You talked about the 10,000 and the 5,000 and 0. How do you do that? What's the basic technology? Is that radiocarbon dating or through cores or what?
Exactly. So the river front, the delta front, or the delta has a flat top and then basically a sloping face. And as the delta advances, the delta builds up a bit. And I didn't talk about this but it can continue to build up because the whole delta itself, because it's a big pile of sediment, is compacting, and so the surface is sinking, and the delta sort of builds up layers, but those layers connect to sort of a steep face that then
It's okay.
We're okay. Okay, good.
Yeah, we're good.
It's fine.
Yeah. And what was I saying? So the delta front advances in the submarine area, and what they can do is they use basically woody debris that they can radiocarbon date at sort of this inflection where they know that inflection was at 10,000 years ago. The beds that are sort of dipping down, they have to sort of drill down into the sediment to find these samples. But when they do, or they can occur in foundations and excavations, when they find these sediments that are sort of dipping down as they do at the front of the delta, but they're in the area of New Westminster, they know that was the front of the delta, New Westminster, and they get a little bit of wood out of those sediments that they can do radiocarbon date, and that gives them the location at 10,000 years. And then perhaps sort of somewhere in mid-Richmond, they're doing an excavation and they run into some of these steeply dipping beds with material in it, and they can date that at, say, 5,000 years, and they know, okay, was the position of the delta 5,000 years ago.
Right.
But you're absolutely right. It's radiocarbon dating of organic material is the critical information.
Well, you said at the outset you wanted some feedback on should you do more of this geology stuff, and absolutely, I thought it was a fascinating thing. Little bit of a story. I traveled through eastern Texas earlier this year, and road cuts, and just always noticing the strata in the road cuts. And I think that'd be kind of a cool project for someone of your caliber. Geology is a highway guide to road cuts and interpreting that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, geologists love road cuts because they sort of expose the earth. I mean,
Yeah.
they can make a mess of a landscape, but you know, the one silver lining to a geologist is they sure sort of give us a cross section into the earth. And you're right, when you're in geographies that have layered rock, they really are outstanding. You know, we're blessed with a lot of granite, and you don't have that layering, so you don't have some of that very dramatic geology exposed in our road cuts.
Yeah, that photo you had up at Whistler with the smooth rock, is that right beside the parking lot? Can anybody, general public, access that? Is there? I'm not hiking up to 700 meters, but might go up 10 meters.
Oh yeah, so if you go to like it's at Squamish Chief.
Yep.
Yeah, and so you're just before you get to Squamish, you know, you crest the hill, you pass the Sea to Sky gondola.
Yep.
Just past that is Squamish Chief Provincial Park. You can pull off right there in the parking lot, and there's a blue pedestrian bridge over top. If you just cross over to the west side of the highway on that blue pedestrian bridge, you get dropped off right on that gorgeous surface.
Cool.
And you can put your nose right down on that sort of polished rock, and you can see the striae. And one of the reasons it's so, and I mentioned this, but I'll say it again, why it is so exquisite right there is that up until the highway work, you know, in 2008 or 9, that polished surface was covered by glacial materials, and it was protected from weathering. And it was only since then, and to their credit, they cleared it off delicately without really breaking up the surface. And so that beautiful surface exists to this day. And if you're driving northbound, I mean southbound on the highway at that point, you have access directly to that rock. It's right up against a little pull-out parking lot that's right there just before you come to the blue bridge, the blue pedestrian.
Well, I'll try to remember next time I go through Squamish.
Yeah, no, it's fun. You really feel like, okay, you're right back there with the glaciers.
Okay, well, thanks again, Bob. That was really fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm sure everybody enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much for your great questions. I really enjoyed putting having the opportunity to put the talk together. You forced me to get my act together and get organized, and I really appreciate that. And you had some great questions, and I appreciate all those as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks,
you,
Bob.
Bob.
Okay. And also, Jack, I just loved that that owl photography, the video. That was really, really exquisite.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you very much, and take a look at the YouTube, because there's we've had the outdoor cameras for about 4 years, and it's just the indoors first time this year.
And what's the name of the site?
Well, Nikki's going to send it out, so
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, no, thanks, Jack. Bye, everybody. Thank you, Elizabeth, for arranging
Bye.
this.
Thanks,
Thank
Bob.
you.
Bob, thank you.